Hello everyone, this is part 24 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of Six Paths, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. Naruto had grown to appreciate the nights out in Kuni during his time at the temple, and during his travels he had honestly missed it. He remembered sitting up on the roof with Sora, neither of them having to say anything, and just staring up at the sky. It was always so clear without all the light pollution you got in the towns or even the hidden village. Every star was crystal clear, hanging against their pitch-black backdrop. All that would permeate the still night air was the ever-present rustling of the countless trees of Kuni's forests and the gentle sounds of cicadas chirping. In all, Naruto couldn't begin to imagine a more serene or peaceful atmosphere, and he had been to enough places now to be sure of that. The three of them had left Kuni shortly after Haku had decided to come with them, crossing the water separating the island from the continent by simply running across. Naruto had been reminded of the time he had crossed between Kaminari and Mizu, as he had been forced to carry Haku part of the way. It quickly became obvious Haku was not the chakra powerhouse that Fu and Naruto could profess to be, although he did have exceptional control that made up for it. Now though, the trio was camped out in the expansive forests that practically covered Kuni. It had been almost a week since Zabuza's death, and Haku was slowly getting used to traveling with somebody other than his late master. Naruto made it as easy as possible for him, making sure the boy was always surrounded by a welcoming atmosphere. It seemed to have somewhat backfired though, as occasionally he would spot Haku looking at him strangely, almost with awe in his eyes. He certainly did not want to be Zabuza's replacement as Haku's master, and how he could prevent that from happening was quickly becoming a concern for the blonde. He sighed on the travel mat he had laid down. Despite the comforting atmosphere and warm night, he just found that he couldn't sleep. Quietly he slipped out of Fuu's arms, making sure not to wake the girl that had somehow slipped into his bed almost without him noticing, and stood up, deciding against taking his shakuju for the moment. For a moment he just looked around at the small camp they had set up. At the center was a smoking pile of ashes that had been a campfire only a few minutes ago, and across from it was the conspicuously empty sleeping mat that Haku should have been lying on. Immediately Naruto stretched out his senses through the water vapor in the air, sighing in relief when he felt Haku just a short distance away from the camp, sitting up on a high branch in a tree. It only took him a few seconds to travel the distance, landing silently behind the boy before taking a seat next to him. Having trouble sleeping, Haku looked around slowly before sighing lightly and looking back up at the sky. From the branch they were sitting on, they had a great view of the surrounding forest, and in the distance they could see the warm glow of a nearby town. When I try, I always have the same dream. Naruto just stayed silent, content to allow his new friend to talk in his own time. I'm back on the bridge, running towards Zabuza-sama as Hatake closes in with his lightning jutsu. Everything seems to be going in slow motion and I feel like I'm moving through water. For some reason I can't use my Kekkei Genkai, like my chakra just refuses to work for me. The water vapor around his hands suddenly condensed as Haku reassured himself he still had his abilities. However, the more I run, the farther away they seem to get. He leaned forward, head down, as another lonely sigh escaped his lips. I always wake up just before the jutsu hits, but by that time I'm almost too far away to even see them. I just feel so helpless, like I was on the bridge. The boy finally looked up, staring briefly at the sky before looking around to Naruto, a questioning look overtaking his features. What do you think it means? Naruto looked at Haku for a moment. The face that had been so innocent when they first met seemed haunted. Bags had begun to form under his eyes and he looked incredibly tired. I don't know, I'm sorry. Tsunade had always been about healing physical things. Matters of the mind were not her area of expertise, even if she could heal the physical trauma of psychological attacks. Haku just sighed as he slumped forward again, this time staring down at the forest floor far below them. The drop may have seemed long to a civilian, but to the both of them it was barely anything. I suppose it could mean a lot of things. I don't profess to be any kind of expert in dreams, but to me it seems like you are stuck in the past. Haku looked up, the questioning look returning as he stared at the blonde. What do you mean? Naruto just looked away, his face becoming thoughtful for a moment as he stared up at the stars. In his childhood he had enjoyed staring up at the stars. For some reason it always made him feel less lonely knowing there was an entire sky above him filled with those little twinkling pinpricks of light. I know how it feels to lose somebody you care for, to feel helpless over the deaths. He looked back down, catching Haku's brown orbs for a moment as he smiled softly. However, you can't hold on to them selfishly like that. Before Haku could say anything, he raised a hand, quieting his protests. Always cherish their memory, never forget them. His smile became sadder for a moment, but it could almost have been a trick of the light for the time it lasted. But allow him to rest in peace. You have to accept Zabuza's death. Haku opened his mouth to speak but found words failing him, so for a few moments the two just sat there in silence. I'm not sure if I can. Naruto just smiled and patted his friend on the back comfortingly. It's not an easy thing to do. Trust me, if I could go back and do something, anything to save Shizuku, then I think I would. Haku looked around curiously at the blonde. Shizuku. Naruto's smile lessened for a moment. That's a story for another time. Haku just nodded in understanding. He had plenty of opportunity to get to know Naruto and Fu in the future, including their pasts. However, Naruto could still see a troubled expression on the young Isuzu's face. That's not the only thing troubling you, is it? Haku looked up, slightly surprised Naruto had noticed before looking back down, suddenly finding his hands incredibly interesting. No, there was something else. The dark-haired boy frowned before shaking his slightly. But it's nothing, I don't even know if it was real. Naruto said nothing for a while as they lapsed into silence again. This time there was a strange tension hanging between them. It seems important to you anyway. Haku just nodded slowly, silence overtaking the duo again as Haku just continued to stare ahead. Naruto, what do you think happens to us when we S? The blonde looked around sharply, his eyes widening slightly in surprise at the sudden question. He blinked, noticing that Haku hadn't turned. He simply looked down at the ground with an unflinching gaze, unmoving. Finally Naruto sighed. I really haven't given it much thought. A soft smile slipped onto his face as he looked up at the sky. I like to think that we go somewhere good where everybody we think of as precious is waiting for us. He sighed wistfully, the briefest image of Tsuki, Ayami and Shizuku flashing across his vision. But then again, maybe death is simply the end and we simply cease to be, making room for the next life to come into the world. He looked across at Haku for a moment, silently for a moment, wondering why he had lied like that. After Shizuku had he had given it a lot of thought, especially considering he had literally held what most likely been Yagura's soul in his hand. It just seemed like the right thing to say, and it at least seemed to bring a little peace to Haku as he finally looked up. Naruto gave the boy a warm smile as he gently patted him on the back, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. But I should be asking you, right? After all, you were the one that came back. Any hint of warmth on Haku's face almost immediately faded as his expression turned downcast. Naruto regretted his words as the boy next to him frowned, a slightly pained expression flitting across his features. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean. Haku just held up a hand, waving away Naruto's apology quickly. No, it's all right, I know what you mean. It's just. The boy frowned again as he stared intently at the ground. When I was. Haku paused to choose his words carefully. Gone, I didn't just stop. In fact, I remember it. Naruto's eyes widened again in surprise. I don't know if it was just a dream or some kind of hallucination, but at first I was walking through this black space. It seemed so vast and infinite that I felt lost just looking around. The boy looked back at Naruto, seeming to gain some confidence as he talked. I don't know how long I was gone exactly, but it seemed like I was there for at least an hour. At some point I spotted a light, and when I walked over it was like stepping into a different world. One moment I was surrounded by darkness, the next I was in Mizuno Kuni, out in one of the forests. It was night and very dark, I could barely see 20 feet in any direction, but I had walked into some kind of camp. The previously pained expression tuned into a saddened smile as the boy glanced back to their own camp. My mother was there. She said she had been waiting for me for a long time, even though she was sad that it had come so soon. I didn't know what to say to her, but she got up and hugged me, telling me how sorry she was for what happened. Slowly, As the boy spoke, his smile gained warmth as his eyes drifted off, remembering as much as he could of that dreamlike encounter. I cried for a while and she just held me, whispering that she was proud of the good life I had tried to lead, proud that I had stuck to my beliefs and never anybody, not becoming the weapon she never wanted me to become. Haku's smile dimmed again, and when he looked back around at Naruto, tears were percolating at the edge of his eyes. Before I could say anything, everything seemed to glow green. My mother just looked at me happily and told me that it wasn't my time yet and she would still be there, waiting for me when it did finally come. Suddenly his entire demeanor shifted as a hint of pink entered the boy's cheeks. He shifted nervously on the branch and coughed into his hand. Then she told me to find a girl to settle down with so that she could have the grandchildren she had always wanted. Naruto had to stifle a small chuckle as Haku composed himself again, shaking his head to rid himself of the embarrassing thought. After that, I woke up in that clearing with you and Fu. Naruto just took it all in for a moment in silence, absorbing what Haku had told him as the boy looked at him expectantly. Do you think it was real? Naruto stayed impassive, his face revealing nothing as he looked away, once more drawing strength from the stars above them. I don't think it matters. Haku looked around, shocked, but more so curious about Naruto's response. Naruto just gave him a smile as he stretched his arms out, suddenly feeling rather sleepy. Whether it was a dream, or a hallucination or not, all that matters is that you experienced it. Do you feel better knowing that your mother is proud of your life? Haku nodded slowly and Naruto's smile grew. Well then it's real, because you can use that feeling and continue to make her proud. Haku just blinked at that, leaning back on his hands as he just sat there silently, taking that in. Finally a soft smile of his own settled on his face as his whole body seemed to relax. Thank you Naruto, I think you're right. Naruto just nodded happily, noting that Haku was starting to sway on the branch a little as their respective exhaustion from the long walk that day hit them both. Good, now come on back to camp, we'll need some rest if we're going to get all the way to Kirigakure. Haku just nodded tiredly as he allowed Naruto to lead him back to camp. He spared one last look up at the sky before yawning and following the blonde, the small smile never leaving his face for even a moment. Hey Temari, wait up. Sand blew lazily across the ground, picked up by the wind into a small whirlwind of dust that was common in Sunagakure. A tall girl with sandy blonde hair, tied back into 4 short ponytails, turned in the street, shifting the large black object on her back. It was heavy and even though she had been using it for years now it was still somewhat uncomfortable. Unfortunately her father insisted on her always carrying it. When she turned she spotted a much shorter girl rushing down the street towards her. Matsuri, what is it? She gave the girl a moment to catch up with her as she had obviously run quite a distance to find her. Finally the younger girl stood up straight, brushing her hair out of her face with a smile. Baki-sensei wants to see us all, something about the upcoming Chunin exams. Do you think he wants us to enter them? Temari just smirked at the younger girl, reaching forward to brush her soft, shoulder-length hair over one ear. After Gaara had left the village, Temari had taken a turn for the worse. She somewhat blamed herself for not being there for her brother enough. For a long time she was lacking energy in her training, it just didn't seem to be worth it anymore. Sure, she was still the daughter of the Kazekage and as such many things were expected of her, but she just didn't see the point if she couldn't protect her baby brother. Of course he wants to enter us. Hell, Kankuro and I have been ready for at least a year and we all know how far you've come along. The younger girl beamed at the praise. A few years ago she had been the talk of Suna, graduating almost 3 whole years early from the academy. Suna hadn't had a true prodigy since Akasuna no Sasori and her father had used the opportunity to fill the spot Gaara had left on the team they would have formed. At first it was odd working with somebody so much younger than them, but Matsuri was dedicated and highly competent. It certainly helped that she had a secondary affinity to wind which immediately made Baki take a shine to her. Cool, we better go find Kankuro then. Temari just smiled. She had come to see Matsuri as somewhat of a little sister and it felt nice to finally have a younger sibling she could dote on. Deep inside her though she still wished that she could see her little brother one last time, just to apologize that she couldn't be the big sister she should have been. With a small sigh she allowed the younger girl to pull her along. She was sure that whatever Baki wanted to see them about would be important. He didn't usually call them on their free days. Stop moving around so much, B. A cruel laugh filled the night air, accompanied by the sounds of struggle and muffled, but still defiant murmurs of protest. A large burly man with a rusty blade strapped to his back walked along the outskirts of a small town in No Kuni, heading back towards the camp where he and his friends had set up for the night. He had a smile on his face, knowing it was worth it as his free hand shamelessly groped the young girl he had carelessly slung over his shoulder. "Hey, I said knock it off." He squeezed harder on the soft flesh he had been fondling as the girl once again tried to lash out at him with her legs in a futile effort to make him drop her. All he heard was her quietly whimper in pain, doing her best not to give him the satisfaction of her screams. The bandit just grinned again. He loved it even more when they fought back as it made the whole experience more rewarding at the end. He frowned as the dust in front of him picked up slightly, making him shield his face. He just ignored it, putting it down to the wind. "Put her down." The man grunted in annoyance as a gravelly voice set off his pleasant stroll, forcing him to turn around and face the newcomer. He was actually a little surprised when he turned, expecting the low voice to have came from a man. Instead he found himself looking at a young boy with rusty maroon hair and thick black rings around his eyes. "Hey, F off kid, can't you see I'm busy here?" The boy's face didn't change in the slightest, actually unsettling the thug slightly with the intensity of that impassive, emotionless glare. "I said to put her down." Just like his face, the boy's voice didn't shift from that gravelly tone that made small shivers run down the man's back. He shook him off though, drawing his long but poorly maintained blade with the hand he wasn't using to hold the teenage girl against his shoulder. "Really? And how the F are you going to make me a? You're just a little." The man never got to finish his sentence as the ground beneath him suddenly lurched, bursting open as if a door to hell was opening beneath his feet. He was surrounded on all sides by large walls of sand and he had just enough time to scream for a second before they collapsed inwards, crushing his body ruthlessly. When the dust finally cleared, the girl was laying there dazed on the ground, surrounded by sand with no sign of the brute that had been carrying her. "Are you okay?" Her head snapped around at the voice of the young boy, looking completely unconcerned that he had just mercilessly destroyed the bandit without any effort. Why yeah, I guess." The boy just nodded before offering his hand. The girl took it gratefully as she allowed herself to be pulled off the ground. Thanks." The boy looked up at her. His expression still hadn't changed, which was slightly unnerving, but he had saved her from the brute of a man, so she owed him a lot. "Gara." The young girl nodded nervously. It sounded like a K's no Kuni name and she wondered why one of their shinobi would be all the way out here. After all, he couldn't fathom how he could do what he did with the sand if he wasn't a ninja. "I'm Sasam." Gara simply nodded impassively again as the girl brushed down her clothes. She had long orange hair flowing down her back, forming two straight bangs at the front that framed her face. "You should get back to your village soon." The girl nodded quickly and gave the boy a wan smile. Thanks. Is there anything I can do to repay you for, saving me?" Gara stared at her for a moment before giving a conceding nod. "Some food and a place to sleep for the night would be appreciated." Sasam managed a wider smile as she started walking back to her village. Her clan wasn't too fond of outsiders, but she was sure they could make an exception for somebody who had saved her. "Sure, I can do that." As they walked off, a tiny smile appeared on Gara's face. The last 2 years of traveling had been rather kind to him, or at least eventful. At first he had simply wandered aimlessly, unsure of what to do with himself. Somehow though, he always seemed to walk into some kind of trouble wherever he went. It seemed his luck had held true even here. He took a sideways glance at the girl walking beside him before she caught him staring and he turned away. Briefly he wondered why his cheeks suddenly felt warmer but ignored it. He hadn't eaten for a day and he was looking forward to the upcoming meal. He completely missed the hint of pink that had managed to enter Sasam's cheeks when she caught his look. "Hey Kuretsuki, stop daydreaming about that blonde kid again." A resounding smack of flesh hitting flesh echoed through the stone hallways of the Tsuchikage Tower as Kuretsuki buried her fist in her partner's stomach. Of course, after a moment Akatsuki simply stuck his tongue out at the girl, not even seeming to feel the blow that would have decked most chunin. The tomboyish girl's eye twitched at her companion's seemingly invulnerability to her blows as he walked off. "I was not thinking about him, damn it." Akatsuki just laughed jovially as his footsteps echoed against the stone slabs on the floor. They were deep inside the heart of the mountain that marked the center of Awagakur, the most protected and heavily defended space in the country, possibly even the continent. Sure, whatever you say. Kuretsuki growled dangerously at the lumbering boy. Ever since running into that kid a year ago, he had never let go of that one thoughtful look she had sent his way. It wasn't her fault that the kid looked like a spitting image of a younger Yondaime Hokage, widely considered to be an incredibly handsome man, even in Tsuchi no Kuni. Though not handsome enough to make up for all the other things he was considered. Whatever, what does Gigi want now? At that, Akatsuki's jolly grin faded somewhat. She had only ever seen it actually disappear in combat and had to discern his feelings based on the degree of his grin. This one meant that he was nervous or anxious about something, and combining that with her grandfather, and it didn't bode well. The Chunin exams are in Konoha this time around, and you know what that means. Kuretsuki just groaned. She had been on a lot of back-to-back missions lately, and the upcoming exams had slipped her mind. Unoki was always pretty grumpy, but it would only get worse whenever some big event was being held in Konoha. The man held no personal feelings towards any one person there, alive or except perhaps for his longtime rival Hiruzen Sarutobi, but after losing 2 wars to them there was definite bad blood between the two nations. Damn it, I just got back as well. Akatsuki just shrugged, his grin growing again as he thought of what was coming up. Around this time, when Unoki's moods took a dive, he would always lash out at anybody close to him, usually that meant Kuretsuki due to her habit of walking into his study unannounced. Oh well. Kuretsuki just grinned evilly at her companion as they continued to make their way to the Tsuchikage's office. Hey, if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me. Akatsuki's grin dropped quite considerably at that as his usually rosy cheeks paled, making him freeze in place for a moment. Ah, you're just joking, right? Kuretsuki simply gave him another sinister smile as she walked off down the hallway. Kuretsuki. The boy groaned pitifully as the girl didn't answer him. With a great deal of reluctance he followed after her. I have a bad feeling about this. Mabui sighed slightly as she looked up from her desk, the never-ending stream of documents and files she had to review and sign off on before sending to the Raikage sat to one side, taunting her. Darui stood in front of her, patiently waiting for her to finish the papers she had been looking over, requests from a nearby farming village for protection against raiders that had been bothering the region recently. She had always liked Darui. He was one of Kumogakure's top shinobi, a high A rank, but more importantly he was a naturally quiet person, something she, as a secretary, appreciated. If you're waiting to see the Raikage, I would wait for a while, he's in one of his moods. Darui winced slightly at that. As one of the Raikage's most trusted guards when he left the village, he, better than anybody, understood exactly how he could get in one of his moods. Who's in there with him? Mabui sighed again. Slumping forward slightly, she remembered her past, when she had just been a simple Kunoiki, patriotic and naive like all good Kumo shinobi, how times had changed. It's Yugito. Darui just grimaced. Ever since the girl had her biju removed by the same person who had stolen the Kohaku no Johei, she had been short-tempered and irritable. Putting her in the same room as the Raikage was asking for trouble, she had calmed down a lot recently, especially with Kiribi's help, but she was still very volatile. It didn't help that everybody knew the Raikage held resentment against her for being defeated and losing one of Kumo's prized and irreplaceable weapons to a child, even if Yugito maintained it had to be a henge. I'll go then, see you tomorrow, Mabui. The dark-skinned woman just nodded wearily, tapping her pen against the desk as she stared hopelessly at the piles of paperwork she still had to sort through. Oh Darui, bring your Genin team tomorrow. The Raikage wants to speak to all the current Junin sensei about the upcoming Chunin exams. Darui raised an eyebrow at that, wondering what the leader of their village could possibly want to talk about. At that moment though they both heard the telltale sounds of a window shattering before the office door burst open and Yugito stormed out. Despite having her biju removed, she was an incredibly formidable Kunoiki and many people immediately rushed to get out of her way. The blue flames encompassing her hands was also good incentive. Should we be worried about that? Darui looked around but found Mabui to be ignoring him, once again engrossed in her work. He simply sighed and strolled out. It was getting too dull for him anyway. It was dark and cold, and the air reeked of disinfectants mixed with bee. Most of the time these conditions would be a warning sign to most people. Of course Orochimaru was not most people. As he walked down the corridor of one of his many hidden bases scattered around the elemental nations, he was smiling. It was a sick, twisted perversion of what most would call a smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. He was in high spirits as the groans and screams of test subjects rang out around him, echoing off of the uniformly patterned walls that made his bases maze-like and disorienting. Of course, his companion didn't seem to be nearly as appreciative of the dank environment. They moved beside him with a dark expression on their face, mostly hidden by the wide hat they wore, decorated on the front by the symbol of their nation. Orochimaru ignored this though. He didn't expect people to find pleasure in knowledge and understanding as he did. It was enough that he knew. In fact, he couldn't care less about other people save as a means to an end, or in the rare privileged case, an interesting test subject. Sure, he could feign compassion, put on a fake smile and a warm facade, but his cold, calculating eyes were always moving, searching for something to satiate his burning curiosity. You know, I would almost find this little meeting amusing if it wasn't so interesting for me. The man walking beside the snake Sannin just sneered but said nothing, actively avoiding looking at the pale man. Before the third shinobi war, you and I would be staunch enemies, and yet now you come to me for help. The other man stayed silent again, wincing slightly as a particularly loud scream see through the other, still unsavory background noises of the base. Do not think we are friends, Orochimaru, or allies. You are simply a means to an end. The Sannin just chuckled slowly, his tongue flickering out between his lips much like the animal he took after. Oh, now that I can understand, I think I will enjoy this little endeavor. Orochimaru's companion just looked at him in disdain before continuing on down the dimly lit corridor. I hope you understand your role in all this though. The other man grunted as if that was an acceptable answer, not stopping for a moment. He just wanted this meeting over so he could get out of these dank corridors. I understand, but what makes you think the boy will even be there? Orochimaru just gave another twisted grin as he caught up to the man. Oh, I don't, but I do know just how powerful nostalgia can be. The other man just nodded quickly before moving on. Orochimaru watched him leave from the shadows of his base, his yellow eyes almost glowing in the dim lighting of the candles. Working with a cage? How interesting. I would like to say I'm still against this. Fuu's voice rang out clearly along the forest trail the trio were taking. It was deep in the forests of High no Kuni and almost exclusively used by shinobi due to the treacherous terrain. And I've already told you there's nothing to worry about, Fu. Naruto was a little ways ahead of her, his long ponytail swaying gently behind him to the rhythm of his shakuju's jingling. Fu had suggested he see it, but the blonde had come to like his hair, white streak included. He figured it made him seem more distinguished now that he lacked his whisker marks. You mean besides being captured and forced to stay within the village as nothing more than a weapon? The hint of bitterness in the girl's voice was unmistakable, and out of the corner of his eye Naruto could see her lightly rub her shoulder where her old village headband had once been. It's not going to happen, Fu. They won't even recognize us, and if worst comes to worst we simply leave. Fu snorted at that, but it didn't sound particularly like amusement. Ever since Naruto had declared his plans to return to Konohagakure, she had been in a foul mood, worsening with every step closer they took. Right, because walking out of a hidden village is so easy. Naruto just smiled at the derisive comment jovially without breaking stride. He knew all these objections were just out of concern for him, so he could easily forgive the girl for being stubborn. It's never stopped us before. Fu was silent a moment, but her eyes still narrowed. Technically Naruto wasn't wrong, but before they had plans, methods of getting out, and nobody there that might recognize the blonde. In Konoha that would be different. There was a reason it was widely considered the most powerful village in the elemental nations. I still think it's a bad idea. Naruto just chuckled lightly as he dropped back to walk beside the green-haired Jinchuriki. Objection duly noted. You now have the right to say, I told you so, if anything goes wrong. Fu tried to fight it, but she just couldn't help the small smile that snuck up on her. She just found it impossible to stay mad at Naruto, despite his best efforts to frustrate her, unintentionally or not. Anyway, Haku wants to go, so it's 2 against 1. The aforementioned dark-haired boy who had been trailing a few paces behind them looked up in surprise as he was suddenly included in the conversation. Ah, all I said was that it would be interesting to visit another of the hidden villages. Naruto smiled at that, still remembering the awed look that Haku had done his best to hide when they had entered Kirigakure. To be fair though, Naruto had felt the same on the inside, but for different reasons. During the Bloodline rebellions, Kirigakure was like the shining jewel of Mizu no Kuni. It was the prize everybody was fighting for, representing victory and control for whichever side won. He and Fu had left before ever seeing it in the hands of the rebels. The country had really flourished since the civil war had ended. Resources started going back to the people and the economy and communities were finally given a chance to rebuild. Kirigakure though was something else. It had hardly taken any damage during the war, so after word that Yagura had been defeated got out, there was only a brief period of resistance before the remaining loyalists surrendered. With the Seven Swordsmen either scattered or else there wasn't really anybody suited to taking Yagura's place. Kirigakure itself was a beautiful village with rising marble buildings in whites and pale blues with a lot of vines growing along the walls, perfect for the damp climate. The perpetual layer of moisture coating everything just gave the entire village a shine as it reflected the weak sunlight around. In the center of it all, on top of a vast network of aqueducts that ferried clean water about the village, was the Mizukage Tower. It was an enormous circular building that acted as the heart and soul of the shinobi village. Of course, this perfect serene image had been somewhat ruined by a flying orange blur going by the name Nezumiro. As soon as word had spread that Naruto had entered the village, she had practically sprinted over to the group, tackling the poor monk right off his feet. In all, it was a fairly nostalgic moment for everybody. However, Naruto had forgotten that they had left Mizu no Kuni rather suddenly without offering much of an explanation, as evidenced when Nezumiro had asked them where Shizuku was. The mood had instantly taken a turn for the worse. Later on in Mei's office, they managed to extract a more or less accurate account of what happened with Yagura, including Shizuku's deaths. Naruto did leave out the part about him using his Bijuu's chakra to defeat the cage, simply telling them he had activated a new aspect of his Rinnegan. Nezumiro had left by that point after consoling him, quite thoroughly much to Fu's hidden ire, over their friends' deaths. After that, it had been a much more simple matter of handing over Zabuza's sword. Then came the matter of Haku. After explaining who he was and how Zabuza had found him, Mei immediately sympathized with the ice user. Both of them had their clans wiped out to near extinction during the purges. Unfortunately, while there were still a few Terumi members around, the Yuki clan had been one of the first to be eradicated and there had been no survivors. Haku took it surprisingly well, and later on he told Naruto and Fu he had already resigned himself to the fact long ago when he had been forced to kill his father in self-defense. After that, Haku had been offered a choice: stay in Mizu no Kuni and work toward rebuilding his clan, or continue traveling with Naruto and Fu. Naruto felt a bit selfish for enjoying the fact Haku chose them, but in their short time traveling together he had quickly become a close friend to both of them. Haku had promised though that when he was older he would return to his village. Until then he wanted to learn more about the world and better refine his bloodline. Mei understood, not wanting to pressure any bloodline clans into doing anything due to what they had all been through. She respected his decision, thanking him for the sword and wished them good luck. However, as they were leaving, she had mentioned the fact that the upcoming Chunin exams were coming up. It was purely because if Haku had stayed she would have considered entering him, but more importantly she noted that they were taking place in Konoha this time around. Just like that Naruto knew he wanted to return to his village, he wasn't sure if it was melancholy or just a hint of homesickness, despite the village not being his home for over 6 years, but he knew he needed to see Konoha again. Right now they were just a few miles away from the village itself. They hadn't been traveling at ninja speed, so the entire journey had taken around 3 weeks. There was plenty of time for the three to get to know one another, each telling the other about their respective pasts. It turned out they all had far more in common than they had previously thought. All three were orphans, all three knew the loss of a precious person, and all of them knew how it felt to be hated and pee for a power they had no control over having. Fu and Naruto learned about Haku's early life with his parents, the day he discovered his abilities and showed his mother, as well as the day he was forced to kill his father after watching B-Man his mother in cold B, just for being different. They also discovered quite a bit about what he had learned under Zabuza's tutelage about advanced chakra control, speed and his Kekkei Genkai. Luckily Mei had managed to provide him with a few scrolls detailing some of his clan's techniques that had survived the purges, in the hopes that it would serve as incentive for him to return later on. Fu told him about her treatment in the village, how little she had known about the world besides combat and very specific history before being rescued. Other than that, she had very little to tell about herself. Her childhood was about as stunted as they come. If anything, it was more mechanical than natural. Naruto finished up by telling him about his own childhood, how the villagers would mostly pretend he didn't exist. Over the weeks, Haku earned their trust enough that Naruto showed him his Rinnegan, telling the boy about it and everything he had gone through to fully awaken it to this point. After that, the three had a genuine connection, one built on shared experiences and empathy for the other's situation. It was also nice for Naruto to have another boy to talk with. There were just some things he felt uncomfortable bringing up with Fu sometimes, even if she was his best friend. I think we're almost there now. Naruto's voice was outwardly confident as his eyes glanced around at his surroundings. It had been a long time since he had been in Hino Kuni except for passing through, and even longer since he had been around the village, and at the time he was only 7. And we are supposed to trust your judgment on this. Over the weeks traveling with the two, Haku had really loosened up, no longer having to conform to any kind of attitude like he did serving under Zabuza. Naruto was sure he wanted to simply shift that relationship onto him, but instead Naruto coaxed him with a friendly atmosphere, and eventually Haku simply accepted the two as friends, nothing more. You're not going to let that go, are you? Naruto's voice made Fu smirk slightly as she walked behind the two boys. Well, you did get us lost for about a week. Naruto just sighed and put a palm up to his temple. Haku was never going to let it go. The fact that the almighty Rinnegan bearer, the man with the most powerful eyes in the world, managed to get lost in the very forests that were his home. I already told you, the map that man sold us was completely fake. Blame Fu for buying it off him. At that, the mint-haired Jinchuriki sent a mild glare at the blonde before waving casually at the dark-haired boy. Haku was the one who said he seemed trustworthy. Naruto just smirked as he nudged the other boy on the shoulder. I don't think Haku understands when somebody is untrustworthy. It was Haku's turn to send a small glare at the blonde as he crossed his hands in front of his sea, made more difficult by the bulky traveling cloak he was wearing over his clothing. They had decided that a Kiri hunter in uniform was a bit conspicuous, so at the first town they had come across they had bought Haku some new clothing. Naturally, the boy had chosen quite possibly the most androgynous outfit in there, a simple lilac shirt that seemed far too large for him, leaving the sleeves to hang past his hands and the hem to drape about him like a skirt, as well as very baggy maroon shorts that just came past his knees. Over that he wore a simple but thick sky blue kimono with white trim, similar to the one he wore in his disguise. And you're one to talk. Are you not the one who was naive enough to believe that talking to me when I was quite obviously hostile was a good idea? Naruto's smirk flipped to a genuine grin at that as he casually wrapped an arm around Fu's shoulders. But wasn't it? Fu's eyes narrowed in mock irritation, but her small smile belayed how she really felt. That's beside the point. Naruto's grin only grew at that. At this point, Haku had started to drift behind the pair slightly. It wasn't uncommon for them to start talking and just sort of forget Haku was there. He couldn't blame them as he had a rather meek presence and was quite quiet unless prompted. Of course, Naruto immediately noticed him trying to slink back and blend in with the road and immediately grabbed his hand, pulling him back up. Where are you going? I thought we were talking, Ne. Haku merely offered a timid smile but really had nothing else to say, so the group lapsed into a brief silence. Luckily for them, it couldn't last too long as the tree line finally broke before them to reveal a sight that Naruto hadn't seen in over 6 years. Wow, I never imagined it was so large. Naruto found a grin forming on his features as Haku's awed voice see through the group's silence. Konoha really was a sight, bathed in the light streaming down from the mid-morning sun, reflecting off of shop windows and metal ornaments hanging in merchant stalls. The many red-tiled roofs of the old and new buildings, mishmatched together to create a diverse, ever-changing landscape of traditional and modern housing. The village itself was a sprawling mass of streets and people, spreading out in a large semicircle from the mountain that stood sentinel over it. That was the most impressive part, the Hokage Monument. A towering mass of rock and stone that could cast the entire village into shadow if the sun was behind it. Engraved on it were the likenesses of the village's greatest heroes and leaders, the Hokage, past and present. Naruto took a moment to look at the visage of Hashirama Senju, the man who had captured the majority of the Biju and handed them out in an attempt to balance the power of the nations. He had caused a lot of problem for the Biju in his bid for peace, but Naruto couldn't fault him for that. He had been acting in the best interests of his people and didn't know the consequences of his actions. Yeah, it's really something, isn't it? Naruto's grin turned into a lopsided smile as he looked out at his home village. It really hadn't changed since he'd been gone. At least not in any ways he noticed. It's certainly very large. Naruto sighed at that. Fuu's tone was clipped and withdrawn, telling of her dislike of the situation. She wasn't very happy with walking into a hidden village after her childhood. He suspected the only reason she had been even remotely comfortable in Kumogakure was due to how soon it was after she had left Takagakure. Now that Naruto thought about it, though, she had been very reclusive and introverted then as well. Kirigakure had been fine because they were constantly surrounded by people she at least knew somewhat and knew mean her no harm. Well, yeah, I guess it is. Naruto shrugged. He supposed he should be glad Fu was talking at all. He could tell she was secretly unhappy with him for this, even if she wouldn't openly admit it. It took them another few minutes to hike the rest of the way to the village, and most of the way there was a slightly awkward silence between the trio. Naruto couldn't think of what to say to Fu while Fu simply didn't want to talk. Haku was perfectly fine blending into the silence as he was used to it at this stage in his life. Eventually the great wooden gates of Konohagakure loomed before them like proud sentinels of the shinobi village. They were opened all the way to admit the many spectators and nobles that had traveled far to see the newest batch of potential Chunin. These events were more of a publicity affair than actual tests to determine a rank. After all, most shinobi made their rank through field promotions. The exams themselves were mostly to show off the power in the newest generation, representing the power of their village as a whole in order to draw in clients. Hey, excuse me. Naruto looked around, noticing the guard sitting in a small box-like building just inside the gate. He blinked as he realized he had been daydreaming before walking over to the guard, a tall man with his dark purple hair hanging out in long spikes with a small strip of a beard and a bandage wrapped across his nose. Hello, we'd like to enter the village. The man just looked past him at Fu and Haku disinterestedly, probably bored at having to admit so many people. That at least would work in Naruto's favor. He doubted that many would recognize him without his whiskers, but just in case he wore his shugegasa to hide at least the top of his hair, the long spiky ponytail he could do little about. Yeah, you here for the Chunin exams? Naruto just nodded pleasantly, his usual squinted look firmly back on his face. Traveling with Haku and Fu, who knew all his secrets, he hadn't had to bother, but he definitely couldn't risk people seeing his Rinnegan. Most of these people were highly trained shinobi, and even if they didn't recognize it as one of the legendary three, it was still obviously a dojutsu of some sort. Alright then, you need to sign a waiver stating you won't cause trouble in the village. Anything you do will be made accountable to you or your friends, and the shinobi will be able to deal with it as they see fit. Again Naruto nodded, but a small frown flickered across his face. He realized it was a ninja village, but the amount of unquestionable power they held was somewhat troubling. Well, alright then, you're welcome to get a room in any hotel besides those closest to the training grounds to the east and west of the village. Those are reserved for the foreign participants. Naruto just nodded again, figuring that talking as little as possible would most likely help in keeping his Idini secret. Enjoy your stay in Konohagakure no Sato and enjoy the Chunin exams. There should be some pretty cool stuff going on this year, what with the last Uchiha participating. At that Naruto raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. That would mean that if he stayed, the last Uchiha would have been in his graduating year. As the three walked away from the small stand, he could faintly hear the gate guard whispering to his companion in hushed tones. They obviously didn't expect him to be able to hear them from this distance. Did you see that symbol on his robes? The other guard, a man with lank brown hair tied up in a bandana with a strange skin-tight underlay that came all the way up to his chin, just responded with a near unintelligible grunt, obviously far too bored to be looking at people's clothing. It was the symbol of the fire temple. I wonder what one of their monks is doing out here. Naruto slowed his pace slightly so he wouldn't walk out of range of the two. What do you mean? He's probably just here for the Chunin exams like everybody else. His tone conveyed his absolute disinterest with the subject. It appeared his partner would often talk to him about inane things. They don't usually care about that kind of stuff, right? The other guard merely shrugged, looking about ready to drop to the desk and just sleep. One of Asuma's brats is in it, right? Maybe he's just here to see him. Maybe he's one of the Guardian's students come to see another. The first guard just frowned, seemingly unconvinced, although Naruto had a sneaking feeling that he was simply trying to find excitement in his dull day, thankfully for the blonde. Maybe, but should we report it to the Hokage anyway? At that Naruto nearly froze, but managed to just slow his pace again slightly, confusing Haku as the boy hadn't been trying to listen to the two Chunins' conversation. Just let it go man, ain't it bad karma or something to mess with monks? At that Naruto let out an inaudible sigh, picking up his pace once again. Yeah, I guess you're right. A soft smile replaced the worried frown that had crept onto Naruto's features, and with more confidence in his step the young monk continued on into the village with his friends. Luckily they didn't seem to attract much attention. After all, they were just 3 kids walking through the village. They were dressed a little strangely, but with all the foreigners flocking to Konoha for the Chunin exams, different was the norm. So where are we going first? Haku nudged the blonde slightly as they walked, pulling the boy out of his thoughts. The familiar sights and sounds of his childhood home had sent Naruto off into his memories, picking out little details he remembered from when he was 7. The alleyway they had just walked past had been one of his favorite escape routes when running after a prank. There was a little hole in the fence just large enough for his young body to fit through, while his pursuers, generally angry prank victims, had to take a longer way. I want to show you guys around, but first I think we should find a place to stay. The exam's final round isn't for a few more days. Fu just nodded from his right. She had a neutral look on her face since entering the village, but Naruto had known her too long not to recognize the fact she was mentally withdrawing on herself. The mint-haired Jinchuriki was not good with large gathering of people, and you didn't get a much larger or more diverse crowd than the melting pot that was Konohagakure. So a temple then. There was no question in her impassive voice, but Naruto nodded nonetheless, stopping for a moment to dredge up 6-year-old memories. It made him wonder how he had actually managed to remember things before his Rinnegan made his memory practically photographic. Yeah, if I remember right, then I think there should be one a few streets from the main market. The man there was always nice to me, he gave me food sometimes. At that a small smile finally wormed its way onto Fuu's face. It was good to know that out of all the stories Naruto had told her of his pained childhood, there had been a few decent people. Of course, the fact that a young boy would have to think so much of even the meager offering of food a monk could give him was equally depressing, making the smile immediately slip away. A few minutes later, and a lot of navigating through bustling market streets, and the trio was standing outside of a small, dilapidated temple. However, the building seemed deserted. The glass on the windows was choked with dust, and the door itself didn't seem to have been opened in years. As Naruto remembered it, the kindly man who had lived there, who he now understood to have been a monk, had always prided himself on how well he maintained his home and place of meditation. An elderly woman who was out sweeping her porch noticed Naruto staring at the building in confusion, sending him a kindly smile. I don't know what you expected to find here, Sonny, but the old monk that lived there is long gone. Naruto widened his eyes slightly, broken out of his confusion by the croaky voice. Do you know where he went? The woman peered at Naruto for a moment, and for a second he feared she had recognized him. However, she simply appeared to be looking over his robes before her eyes lingered on the long monk staff in his hand. Ah, you're a monk then? No, sorry, I have no idea where he went. The woman sighed, resting against her broom and wiping a few strands of her graying hair away from her eyes. Shame too, very nice man, always helping everybody he could. One day he was here, doing what he usually did, then around 6 years ago he just up and left. Apparently he got some kind of message from the head monk of the fire temple itself telling him to move out of Konoha. The woman shook her head before allowing a kindly smile to alight on her wrinkled features. But I don't believe that personally. I mean, why would he ask him to do that? Naruto just nodded idly, tipping his head in thanks. It turned out it was the same story at all of the temples they visited, or at least all of the ones Naruto could remember. It seems 6 years ago they had all just up and left. There were rumors of them returning to the fire temple, but at the time Naruto didn't really know anybody, so a few new arrivals would have gone completely unnoticed. The time was too specific to be a coincidence though. Their leaving seemed to coincide with around the time he had been taken into the fire temple. Finally they had to settle for a small inn that was rather out of the way of the more busy areas of the village, close to the northern edge, near the wall. It was quiet and there were only a few patrons with everybody else jostling for hotels and inns closer to the stadium so that they could get better seats on the day. However, it was ideal for Naruto and his companions. Fewer people just meant less chance of being spotted and recognized. Although he knew it was irrational due to how much he had changed over the years, he still felt like that little kid, just waiting to turn a corner and find those same looks he had grown up with. That's the park. When I was really little, the Hokage once took me there. Right in the middle there's this little hill that lets you see over the trees and gives you a really good view of the Hokage monument. He spent the whole afternoon just sitting with me, talking to me about all the great things the previous Hokage had done. Naruto had a tired smile as he walked past the central park of the village, pointing in the vague direction he remembered that hill to be. I really wanted to believe him back then. I didn't understand why the villagers treated me so differently, so when he told me how these men were so greatly respected and loved, I vowed to become like them so that I could be acknowledged that way too. Naruto chuckled softly as he looked away from the happy memory, one of the precious few he had of that time. Of course now I understand that you aren't respected because you are in a position of power and authority, you get there because you are respected and loved by the people. It was pretty foolish of me, but I was just a kid back then, too naive to realize that I would have to change the hearts of the people if I ever wanted to earn their respect. Haku placed a comforting hand on his shoulder as they walked, Fu a few steps behind, silently absorbing everything he had been saying. It was a good dream. Perhaps if things had been different you might have stayed and really changed how the people saw you. Naruto gave a small shrug, but his smile did widen slightly. Maybe, but who knows? I certainly wouldn't change anything about now though, otherwise I might never have had you too. He purposefully made sure Fu saw him look at her, making the mint-haired girl look down, a stain of red just peeking out from her caramel cheeks. Anyway, I want to show you guys this building that had a great view of this little roof garden I used to watch. At night fireflies would gather there. Haku nodded along as Naruto narrated yet another place in the village he had come to love in his childhood. They were always such little things like a particularly good view or an alleyway where the smell of baked goods wafted through the air. He noticed that apart from a few, mostly involving the Hokage, Naruto didn't have any actual sentimental places. He also noted that Naruto never once mentioned where he lived to them, instead taking them to these small, but still heart-warming places that still managed to hold a small space in his heart. Haku blinked though as he realized Naruto was no longer next to him. Looking around in confusion, he spotted the boy a few meters back, just staring at an empty space beside the street. Naruto. The blonde seemed unresponsive, but when Haku looked around he saw nothing special, just an empty space to the side of the street. It seemed a little strange there was no building or stall there, considering it was a rather busy area of the village, but other than that it was unremarkable. However, Naruto was staring at it as if he could see into the very depths of the pure world itself. Naruto. Fu seemed just as concerned for the young monk as she rested a hand on his shoulder. She nearly gasped though in shock when she noticed a single tear roll its way down the boy's cheek. Never in her time traveling with Naruto had she seen him cry over nothing like this. In fact, the only time she ever recalled seeing tears mar his features was after Shizuku's death. It was here. Naruto's voice was barely a whisper as more tears escaped his eyes to join the first, making small streams down his cheeks. I thought. He just trailed off as he took a step forward, walking out until he was at the center of the tiny plot of land. Quote, ... I thought I had let you rest, but I couldn't. He slowly fell to his knees, much to both Haku and Fuu's shock, who had only ever seen Naruto as an immovable pillar of strength. His fingers grasped at the loose earth around him as a few tears dropped to the ground below him as if trying to expel high anguish. I'm sorry, Ayami. I'm sorry, Tuki II. His breath hitched as he felt a hand gently wrap around his shoulders. When he managed to look up, he saw Fu staring down at him, a soft, compassionate smile on her face. It was the first show of genuine emotion he had seen from her the entire day, but it didn't dry his tears. A moment later he felt Haku's hand also rest on his other shoulder and just about managed a grateful smile to the boy. Who were they? The blonde managed a choked laugh as his grip on the loose soil tightened, making his knuckles turn white. They. A soft smile drifted across his lips as he reached up a sleeve to wipe away his tears as best he could. Quote, ... They were family. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.